All right, this is a very special day for the podcast. So, not only do we have our first international guest, but I'm also honored to have one of the brightest minds I know about the dollar, the euro dollar system, and the global monetary system in general. He's the CEO and portfolio manager at Santiago Capital, but he's also best known as the author of the dollar milkshake theory, Brent Johnson. So, Brent, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate you inviting me. And what is that? I think it's been a couple of years since we first met, and I know we've tried to do this on a few different occasions. So I'm glad we're finally able to do it.
No, appreciate that. Appreciate your time. So a lot of stuff to dive. Let's dive right in. A lot of stuff that I would like to ask, but of course, I want to make you feel comfortable and just I like your train of thought and how things go. So let's see where that brings us.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. The first question, of course, since I do have a Brazilian audience, and Brazil is a very big country, it's an important country, but at the same time is not very talked about in macro, right? And Brazilians are extremely sensitive to to foreign exchange and the dollar itself,
Sure.
to towards the Brazilian real. So I'm trying to avoid that question for you to just explain for the thousandth time what the dollar milkshake theory is, but maybe you could give your perspective or your current assessment of the markets through that lens of your framework, but maybe take into consideration Brazil and what you see happening today. And you take the floor from there, my friend.
Sure. Well, I mean, in general, I think everything right now in the world is okay. You know, we have moderate levels of growth. We don't have any current crises going on. You know, asset prices have risen. Volatility is low. And so right now, just a snapshot view, everything is okay. But the problem is there's a number of factors that could make it not okay very quickly. And I think the biggest factor, and what kind of led to my whole, I don't know, talking about this subject, is all the debt in the world. So I am somebody who thinks that debt does have consequences. And so I don't think you can just borrow forever, even if you're a government, without having some adverse effects. The issue, though, I think, is a lot of people focus on the debt the United States has, and they don't focus as much on all the debt that the rest of the world has. And then the third part of that is, if they do focus on the debt that the rest of the world has, they often overlook the fact that much of the debt that the rest of the world has is in a currency that they can't, quote unquote, print. A lot of it's in dollars. And if you operate on the global stage in the real world, not some imaginary world that you want to exist someday in the future, if you operate on the global stage in the real world, you need dollars to do it. And that's just a fact of life.
Yeah.
And once I kind of and for a long time, I didn't understand what I just said. I didn't understand. I knew the rest of the world, of course, had debt, but I didn't realize the extent that they had it. And I didn't realize that a lot of it was in dollars. And once I figured that out, my kind of whole perspective on everything, I wouldn't say it changed 100%, but it certainly veered left a little bit, I guess is the right way to say it. And it does change a lot of things, because I think a lot of times, and I know I'm rambling here a little bit, but you know, I think a lot of times when I talk to people and they disagree with me, it's because they have analyzed the United States and they have come to the conclusion that this ends very badly. And the answer that I always try to give is that if you analyze the United States in isolation and you really do a deep dive, the only possible conclusion you can come to is that it's going to end really, really badly. The problem is that analyzing the United States in isolation is a fruitless exercise, because we don't live in isolation. It's a globally connected world. Business takes place all over the world. You know, like it or not, the whole world speaks English. Like it or not, the whole world uses the dollar. The United States is either the number one or number two biggest customer for almost every country in the world as far as their exports. And so the idea that you can analyze another country all by itself, whether it's Brazil or Spain or Russia or China or the United States, all by itself, and come to a rational conclusion of what's going to happen, I think, in my opinion, is wrong. And so, but that's what I used to do. That's what I used to do. I used to have a much different outlook for the United States. But once I kind of took off my financial justice warrior glasses and I stopped trying to force my morality on the market and instead just started trying to understand the market as it is rather than how I want it to be, not everything, but a lot of things became more clear. And it's allowed me to kind of understand what's going on. It's allowed me to navigate, the craziness that we've had for the last 5 or 10 years, 15 years, however long you want to make that. And I think it gives me a relatively good path of what's going to happen going forward. Now, I don't pretend to know exactly what's going to happen. I'm not a wizard. I don't have a crystal ball. But I think I'm fairly well prepared for whatever comes. And I think that's the best way to go about it. A lot of people try to be right all the time. I stopped trying to be right all the time and just tried to be prepared all the time. And, don't get me wrong. I like being right. But I'm not always right. I like being right, but I'm not always right. But having this outlook has allowed me to not get hurt when I've been wrong. And listen, I get things wrong all the time. So, I think that's part of the business. And so again, I know I'm rambling on this answer, but I think right now everything is okay. But I think you need to be prepared for it to not be okay. And it could not be okay very quickly. And so that's kind of my state of the markets, I guess.
Got it. Yeah, no, appreciate that. Yeah, that is a great segue to my second question, so to speak. So you always talk about how it is important not to look at the United States as something completely isolated, and yeah, totally agree with you there. And you also mentioned how a little bit of the unfair advantage that the U.S. has based on how the current system actually works. I would like to dive a little bit into that concept of the money printing kind of thing that it generates a lot of confusion. I see many different opinions on how the mechanics actually happen. What comes to the Fed and what comes to a QE, for example, being an asset swap, or the ability for banks outside of the United States into the Eurodollar system to do that without a control. Do we have that much of a control in the United States to actually dictate like M2 or money supply? How do you see that going?
So I think there's two different ways to look at this, on a relative basis and on an absolute basis. So I would say on a relative basis, the US has control. In other words, they have more control than any other country by far. Now, again, maybe that's deserved, maybe it's not deserved, but that's just reality. Now, having said that, I don't think that the United States is quote unquote in control. I think the Eurodollar system has grown to such a level and such a size, and it is so complicated. And I don't think that the Fed or the US government or the monetary authorities have complete control over it. And I think in many ways, the Fed is a reactionary agency. They're reacting to what the market is doing, and they are trying to, when the leak starts to happen in the dam, they're trying to plug the leaks. And so I think they're the best at plugging the leaks in the world, but it doesn't mean they're perfect. And I don't think that they have and really, my entire thesis, I'm sure we're going to talk about the dollar milkshake at some point. It's hard to talk to me and not talk about the dollar milkshake, right? But I think the one thing that many people don't realize is the milkshake at its zenith or at its end is the U.S. losing control, is the Fed losing control. And it's just that I think when the Fed loses control, the dollar goes a lot higher rather than lower. And a lot of that is because of the Eurodollar system. It's because Brazilian banks making loans in dollars. It's because Brazilian businessmen invoicing their counterparts in dollars. It's because Turkey trading with Spain in dollars. It's because the Philippines and Australia invoicing, their commerce in dollars. And of course, there's always some exceptions. You know, you can find countries that are trading amongst themselves, but in general, the largest portion of the world economy, the trade that goes on, is done in dollars. And as a result, this entire network of dollar-based credit and money creation exists outside the domestic United States. And the Fed, they have influence, but they don't have jurisdiction over the whole world. And so when that market starts to go haywire, it kind of bounces back on the US domestic economy, and then they have to react to it. So, and I think that's largely what happens. You know, the Fed can kind of steer it a little bit, but they're not in control. And I think when it gets really out of control, I think really bad things will happen.
For sure.
But, you know, I don't know if that happens next year or 10 years from now. I just know that the system, if you understand the design of the system, it's because you were asking about the mechanics, right? And there's a couple different ways to look at this. It kind of goes back to what is money, how is money created, and there's a couple different answers to this, but on the one hand, money is what the free market determines, right? And it's the most marketable commodity. It's the good that satisfies the double coincidence of wants. It's the commodity that is most used in exchange and has the smallest spread and can't be debased and And if we just had a totally free market, that is what money would be. But we don't have a free market. We just don't. Governments all over the world are always trying to influence the markets. And so we don't have a free market. And legal tender laws and the money that the governments that make you pay taxes, the taxes give the money value. Now, people don't like it when I say that, but if taxes didn't create any value, then why have the legal tender laws in the first place? The legal tender laws are saying this is what you need in order to pay your taxes, essentially. And so on the one hand, money is created by banks around the world making new loans. It's a debt-based monetary system. There is some money that actually exists in physical form, and all other money has been loaned into existence. And inside the United States, all the banks have reserves at the Fed. Now, some people say those reserves are money, and some people say they don't. And I don't think we're going to be able to solve that on this show. But at the end of the day, those reserves cannot come out of the banking system. They have to stay in the banking system. But what the banks can do is they can use those reserves as collateral to create new money via loans. Now, in the United States, there's collateral. There's that base money that's collateral, and the Fed can create new money or new base money, through QE or a swap or whatever it is, in some kind of a negative scenario. The problem is that same system exists outside the United States. Again, it's Brazilian banks making dollar-based loans. It's Chinese banks extending credit in dollars. The problem, and so that's how money gets created as well. The problem, though, is those entities cannot create base money. They can't, quote unquote, print money. They can loan it into existence, but when they do that, they risk their own balance sheet. So the US government is the only country in the world that has global seigniorage. So seigniorage, if people don't know what seigniorage is basically the difference in value of what it costs you to create the money and how much you can get for the money. So if it costs you $1 to make a $100 bill, you've just got $99 of seigniorage, right? So the US is the only country that can do that. And that's why, and people don't like this, right? A lot of people say, the US prints these little green pieces of paper, and in exchange, they get oil and cars and, MacBooks and, tennis shoes and houses. And it shouldn't be that way. And you know what? That's a philosophical argument. That's not an economic, because this is the way it is, right? And so when the rest of the world gets in trouble and there's a downturn and you get into that credit crunch, the US is the only one that can plug the hole with new base money. And so that gives the US a big advantage over the rest of the world. And because the rest of the world borrows in dollars and uses dollars, a stronger dollar makes it more expensive for the rest of the world. So if the US ever wants to put the rest of the world under pressure, economic pressure, rather than political pressure or military pressure, they can use economic pressure. And we saw this very clearly in 2022. The US raised rates more times than anybody thought possible. Most people didn't think they could even raise once. They raised, I don't know how many it would initially was, but they went from basically 0 to 5.5%, which is unheard of, right? And it put the rest of the world under extreme pressure. And by doing that, the US is able to kind of remain at the top of the mountain, so to speak, geopolitically. And so this is a way that the US can use the system, the mechanics of the system, to kind of implement their will around the world as a geopolitical tool. And there's not a lot the rest of the world can do to fight against it without, submitting themselves to an immense amount of pain. There are things the rest of the world can do, but there's nothing they can do that won't be painful, right? And most politicians don't want to do the painful thing. Most politicians want to do the nice, easy, fun thing because that's how they get reelected. And so, you get in this dance between, is it a fun world? Everybody's cooperating and we're all working together, or is it kind of a fractured world where, things are, a little rough and, confusing and, volatile. And when that happens, the dollar typically rises. And so again, if we go into a crisis, I don't think it's possible that the United States goes into the crisis and the rest of the world doesn't feel it. Maybe I can be proven wrong on that, but I think that's highly unlikely. So anyway, I keep giving these long rambling answers. I apologize, but
it's fantastic. It is fantastic. No, and it's also a great segue to my next question, though. So in a world that it's still very much integrated because of the leveraging that you talk a lot about, but at the same time having that tendency for de-cooperation or de-globalization or mercantilism or tariffs that are going on all over the place, and also the efforts for that everybody talks about, the BRICS coming up, and they must be very excited about that, right? In a few days from now. How do you see, for example, countries where it's very extreme for now, like Russia with all of the sanctions, and you have at the same time one kind of narrative that, hey, look, they are very affected and American companies are going out of Russia, or some products are not to be found. And then you also have the narrative like, oh, look, we don't need them at all because we do have our own system going on. And actually we're thriving, and Russia is one of the fastest growing countries in Europe. How do you square that? How do you see that going on?
Well, so a couple things. And again, I think it's important to always think on relative terms and think on absolute terms. So, you just said that Russia is the strongest country in Europe. I would probably tend to agree with that. We could probably debate it, but I understand the points that you're making. But just because they are the strong,
not saying that I agree.
No. But I'm saying but I guess the point I would make is just because they are the strongest country in Europe doesn't mean they're strong. This is the comment that people often make to me. Just because the U.S. is doing better than everybody else doesn't mean that they're doing well. And so the same thing applies to China and Russia and some of these other countries. Now, Russia's a little bit, and here's the other thing is, a lot of times when I will make these comments about the BRICS or the rest of the world not being able to, de-dollarize easily without a lot of pain, they will always point out Russia as the example. Well, so Russia is a little different than most countries, right? So Russia is a huge country. They've got enormous amount of resources. They've got a strong military. They're very technologically advanced. They have nuclear weapons, and they have energy, right? Now, not Every country has that. So, you know, from first principles basis, you know, they can kind of feed themselves, they can kind of protect themselves, they can kind of, you know, they could hunker down and be somewhat self-sufficient. You know, maybe they don't have all the technological know-how and the Western expertise that, you know, actually runs the systems that they build and stuff. But, you know, Russia's a very powerful country. And a big reason is because of their natural resources and mainly because of their energy, right? And the nuclear weapons always help. But how many other countries have that, right? Most countries don't have nuclear weapons the way that Russia does. And if they did, you know, it would be very tough for them to use them without being destroyed themselves very quickly. Most countries don't have energy the way that Russia does. And so the idea that the rest of the world can just do this because Russia did it, I think is really wrong. And I want to be clear. A lot of times we'll hear me make kind of, I don't know, pejorative statements about the BRICS or silly statements about the BRICS. It's not that I think badly about the individual countries. You know, Brazil's an incredible country and enormous resources, enormous potential. Same with China, same with India, same with, you know, South Africa. I mean, all of these countries, they have tremendous resources and tremendous opportunities. But just because you say you're going to do something doesn't mean you can actually do it. You know, the BRICS, in many ways, I think the BRICS themselves have not necessarily advertised themselves to be doing what a lot of the BRICS proponents say that they're doing. So in other words, there's a lot of people on social media or you go to conferences and they'll say the BRICS have this plan. They're going to issue this new currency and they're going to back it with the dollar and it's going to be on the blockchain and they're just going to trade amongst themselves and they're not going to do any, you know, the US is going to be left out in the cold. But I mean, the reality is if you actually listen to what the actual people in those countries are doing, they keep saying they're going to do something, but they've never actually done anything. They've promoted trade amongst themselves. They've promoted the ideas of, you know, working together and cooperation. But how many businesses have actually done it, right? How many times has Paulo Lemon been on stage at the BRICS conferences saying, yeah, this is how I am going to do business going forward, right? Or, you know, Lakshmi Mittal in India. How many times has he been on stage with Modi saying, yeah, this BRICS idea and this new currency is how we are going to conduct all our commerce? And so it's not that it can't happen, but if these countries and these companies in these countries were to stop doing business in dollars and do exactly what all the BRICS proponents think that they're going to do, what do you think the United States would do in return? Now, you got a little bit of a hint of it yesterday with Donald Trump on stage. Now, it doesn't really matter whether Donald Trump is the president or not, because any US president would do the same thing that he says he would do. If the rest of the world stopped using the dollar and said, we are no longer going to use the dollar for trade, then the US, whoever the president would say, then you're not selling into the United States anymore. And like I said, we're the either the first or second biggest customer for everybody, right? So, you know, I know if I lost my biggest client or my second biggest client, my company would be negatively impacted. My guess is anybody that's listening that has their own company, imagine your first or your second biggest client going away. How does that impact your ability to operate? My guess is that it would be painful, right? And so the idea that they could just do away with the US and no longer sell into the United States, it's not impossible. They could actually do it, but it would require an incredible amount of pain. And when somebody's business gets shut down because they just signed a trade deal with the US and then all of a sudden they can't do it and their business goes bankrupt because, you know, the president of a country said, we're not going to trade in dollars anymore. Do you think that president's going to be a popular person at home? Probably not, you know? And so this is what I mean by, you know, the difference between what the BRICS could potentially do and how countries could potentially get out from underneath the dollar system, but what they would have to do to actually do it. And so another way of saying this is, well, the other part of it is that if they stop using dollars, let's say the rest of the world says, you know what, we're not using dollars anymore. Okay. So that means that dollars are not going to be circulating around the world. as much as they were before. So the liquidity or the supply of dollars would fall. Well, if the supply of dollar falls, then that means they're going to be, but all of the US dollar debt out there still exists. So now the dollar's rising because there's still all the demand to pay the debt, but there's no longer the supply as much. And then once the supply starts to fall, then you start to get defaults because, okay, if Brazil owes, I don't know, let's just say Japan $100 billion in dollars, and Japan wants dollars, well, then that's demand for dollars that Brazil has. If they're now trading with China in yuan and they're getting yuan for their soybeans rather than dollars, then they've got to go buy those dollars on the market to pay Japan. But if those dollars are not in circulation as much as they used to be, then the price rises, right? And then you start to get defaults. And the problem with defaults is that because it's a debt-based monetary system, because all this money has been loaned into existence, then you get a credit contraction. And everybody knows that in a credit contraction, liquidity disappears. And so if the rest of the world or just the BRICS were going to do this, they would first have to figure out, how do we reconcile all the dollar debt that we owe to each other? And just to put it in perspective, I think most people know that the United States owes like $36 trillion. What most don't realize is that the rest of the world also owes a very similar amount in dollars. So it's not like they just have it sitting around, right? And if they started selling, and then people will say, well, they have a lot of US assets. Okay, if they start selling all their US dollar assets, what happens to the price of those assets? They start to go down. Now, all of a sudden, those assets aren't worth as much. And I promise you, they don't have as much assets as they have debt. And so it's not going to solve the problem. And so this is the thing. They could do it, but it's going to involve an incredible amount of economic pain. And then let's pretend for a second that the countries get together and say, you know what? This is going to be really difficult. It's going to be really painful. There's going to be 2-3 years of just economic brutality, but we're going to do it because this is how we get out from underneath the dollar system. What do you think the United States is going to do when that happens? They're not just going to sit back and let it happen, right? They will do everything that they can to protect their empire. And so again, maybe they shouldn't. Maybe you don't think maybe that's not the nice thing to do, but that's just reality. And so now they have to fight either an economic war or an actual war while their economies are going through this economic pain. It's just really, really, really difficult to do. And my argument is not that these things can't happen. They can happen. But it's if the world ever gets to this point where these things start to happen, I think the dollar will be much higher rather than be much lower.
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that difficulty in actually deleveraging from the dollar, sometimes you see every country deals with that with different ways, right? They have different reserves, and that would be my question. So do you see, for example, smaller countries or countries who have a lot of trouble, let's say Turkey, when they're a little bit for a while losing control on the FX reserves, to have a tendency to actually abandon those local currencies and just adopt the dollar, for example? Like,
yeah, I mean,
like
I think in many cases, I think that is what will happen. Not necessarily because they want to, but because they'll kind of be forced to. And the thing is in many economies, like your neighbor in Argentina is a very good example. The dollar is not their official currency, but unofficially it kind of is, right? I mean, it's a largely dollarized economy. I was there a year and a half ago, and part of the reason I went there is I wanted to kind of see it in person, right? And I talked to a couple different people that are in real estate there, and a couple different business people and investors. And then I just traveled around and went to restaurants and talked to locals, and everybody uses dollars there. And so if and when, and part of the reason is because the local currencies just don't hold their value. And again, I know a lot of people are going to say the US dollar doesn't hold its value either. Okay, fair enough. But compared to their local currencies, it does. I mean, in Argentina, people treated the dollar like gold, quite honestly. And that's the case in many places around the world.
We also see in Brazil a little bit of a trend of something that wasn't available before, just to hold accounts and digital banks, for example, that would allow you to actually hold dollars. And this is a common trend, so people can avoid just doing all that math or having a credit card bill that would be a huge surprise 30 days from now if the exchange rate changed, right? We could ruin a lot of trips. The Brazilians, they come and go all the time from America, for example. Uh, do do you see, for example, it being a benefit? Is there a benefit to that unavoidable faith? Is that something that they should go for? And of course, not you want to describe what it is, but let's say Ecuador, for example, being a country using the U.S. dollar. Do you see them thriving through it, or is that something that is going to get worse over time?
I think it's a case by case basis, because in some places they just don't have the resources or the potential to kind of and maybe if they already have an incredible amount of debt that they just can't overcome, maybe they're still going to have pain. Part of the problem but if you replace a local currency with dollars, the trick is, how do you redenominate the debt? Is the debt all converted into dollar debt as well? If it's not already dollar debt, does it get converted into dollar debt? And if it does get converted into dollar debt, I mean, the dollar will be strong. In most cases, the reason that countries would dollarize is because their local currency has just gotten too weak. Nobody trusts it. It's just ineffective. And so having and if they dollarize, then the dollar would be much more steady or stable than their previous currency. Now, that has many advantages to it, but if they have an incredible amount of debt that they owe and it's now denominated in dollars, they could be in for some economic pain. Again, there is no easy way out of this, right? You are going to have economic pain. Even if everybody dollarizes and we have to grow out of all this debt, there is going to be pain. There is no easy way out of the situation that we found ourselves in. And so, but part of the problem with dollarizing is now you have sort of given up you've given up your monetary sovereignty, right? Every country likes to think that they're their own sovereign. And in many ways that they are, but, again, with the US being the hegemon, they can kind of force their way on some of these smaller, weaker countries.
Mhm. Got it. And yeah, that leads me to another thought. We talk a lot about you talk a lot about the carry trades that happen all over the world, right? Japan to America, and really it gives the impression that it's all about that relative game, and people kind of forgotten the real economy, like an Italian restaurant or just
Yeah.
companies that need credit, and it's looks like everybody's just looking for an arbitrage opportunity somewhere. And we also talk a lot about rate differentials as one of the catalysts for that. But we also see some contrasts on, let's say, Jeff Snyder, for example, talks a lot about how it's way more about risk, or even George Gammon talks about that as well a little bit more. How do you see that happening? So the dynamic of liquidity moving, do you see it more nowadays when you see the whole system as just rate differentials, or something that really it's about risk itself?
Well, so for several years, currencies have mainly moved on rate differentials, because for a long time, again, I know there's exceptions to this, but it's been a relatively peaceful world. There's always skirmishes somewhere, but we haven't had a world war for a long time. And there hasn't been a huge conflict for a long time now. And unfortunately, we seem to be headed on the road to more of these. But rates are probably the biggest determinant of current relative currency levels. But there's a number of other factors that affect it as well. Again, the amount of debt in the currency that affects, and specifically the amount of debt or demand for a currency outside its local jurisdiction. So again, part of the reason that the dollar has remained strong versus its fiat competitors, despite all the money printing, the helicopter money, the bailouts, the stimulus plans, is because there's an incredible amount of demand for dollars outside the United States, because so many institutions, people, governments use the dollar outside the United States. So you're not going to have hyperinflation in a currency that has huge demand outside its domestic borders. But how many people in Europe need Argentinian pesos? How many people in Japan need Argentinian pesos? How many people in Russia need Argentinian pesos? They don't, right? And so nobody outside Argentina needs Argentinian pesos. And so that's why when they would just keep printing pesos and pesos, it would not leave the domestic borders. It stayed home in that one little area. And that's why you had huge levels of inflation, right? And so that affects a currency. So the dollar has the euro dollar market. Now, the euro dollar market is orders of magnitude larger than the US domestic market. Hard to believe, but it is. It's much bigger. And I don't know the size of it because you can't even measure it.
It's a black hole.
But the last time it was tried to be accurately measured was like 25, 30 years ago. And at the time, it was 3 times bigger than the domestic economy. And because the system has to grow to survive, both the domestic system and the international system have grown. So it's at least 3 times and probably many times more than that over that time period. And so external demand for a currency has a huge impact. The other thing is that political stability has a huge impact on the relative value of a currency. And again, I know people say, well, there's no political certainty in the United States anymore. And I agree. But where is it more certain? I mean, you guys have a few political problems in Brazil as well, right? There's a few political problems in Turkey. There's a few political problems in, Japan even. It has, all over the world, there's political problems. So again, I think when you're comparing political problems, you have to make sure you're being as objective as possible, because everybody knows that their local politicians are idiots. Like, everybody just knows that, right? But they always think the foreign politicians are really smart and clever, right? And so I think that's a big thing. But the point you were making a minute ago about the carry trades, I want to touch on that, because I think because we are now in this environment where I think it is largely known that the debts have gotten to such a level all over the world that governments around the world are going to have to do financial repression and inflate away the debt. That's the game plan for how governments always get out of debt. And it's becoming more of a known thing. And as a result, and you see it with Bitcoin going higher and collectibles going higher and gold going higher. This is the quote unquote death of fiat, right? Fiat is all losing value. And because all fiat is losing value, I will often be told fiat versus fiat doesn't matter. If all fiat's being debased, it doesn't really matter if it's all going down against gold or Bitcoin or whatever it is, because it's all trash. But here's the thing is, fiat versus fiat does matter. It has incredible implications. In fact, almost every crisis of the last 25 or 30 years has some element of one currency moving dramatically against the other that causes the crisis. And this is the carry trades that you were talking about. And so if you are, I'll give you just a quick example of the Asian currency crisis. Part of what led to the Asian currency crisis was that in the early 90s, the United States, and I think Western Europe, was in a recession. Growth was very slow. But with the rise of China and all the economies surrounding China, there was growth in Southeast Asia. And so people in the United States and Western Europe were looking for places to put their money that would have higher growth potential. And so they started looking at Southeast Asia. And in order to encourage that money to come into their countries, like Thailand, for example, decided to peg their currency to the dollar. And so when the dollars would go into Thailand, the central bank would take the dollars. They would give the investor Thai baht, and that Thai baht would go get invested. And growth was happening, and the central bank of Thailand would take those dollars and they would buy the Thai baht on the open market to strengthen it, to peg it to the dollar. The reason they pegged it to the dollar was to remove the currency risk, so that the investor coming in from the United States did not have to worry about currency risk and didn't have to worry as much about political risk. And as long as the money was flowing in and as long as asset prices were going higher, that worked. The problem is once it kind of wore out the growth and it started to fall, and then people started pulling their money out, not only was the money not going in, but now it was starting to leave. Thailand ran out of dollars to peg their currency. And when they ran out of dollars to peg the currency changed like 30% overnight. And so all of those people that had taken out, either had debt or obligations in dollars, now had a currency or an asset that was worth 30% less. And that causes a crisis, right? And then that transforms to it. And so that was largely caused by fiat versus fiat. And there's a number of these examples throughout history. And the issue now is essentially that a carry trade is when you borrow in a currency, often a lower yielding currency, and then you go invest it somewhere where you're going to get a higher rate of return. And the difference is the carry. That's the carry that you make by borrowing in that low yielding currency. Now, traditionally, this has changed a little bit recently, but traditionally the United States has had the lowest yielding currency, or the lowest yielding bond and lowest yielding currency. And that was often known as the risk-free rate, right? And so the world would borrow in dollars, and that's what the world has borrowed in dollars, and they have funded businesses, they've funded projects, they've invested around the world, they've invested in the United States businesses, but they've done it by borrowing. And so now the whole world is kind of one big carry trade, right? They borrowed in dollars and they've invested in assets with a higher return. But when those assets stop going up at the rate that they used to, and they start going down, or when the currency loses value versus the dollar, and they can no longer afford to make those dollar debt payments, you get the blow up. So in many ways, the entire system is one big carry trade. And this is why when a country tries to de-dollarize, it's really hard, because the act of de-dollarizing often pushes that country's currency lower versus the dollar, and it blows up their own local carry trade. And that's the point, is that because dollars are loaned into existence, de-dollarization is deleveraging. Deleveraging is painful. And politicians and business people don't like pain. And so that's where we find ourselves.
Got it. Wow. No, incredible explanation there. Let me explain a little bit why Brazil, for example, have such high interest rates. We would think that it would just be the best carry trade ever, like just put money there, right? But that's also the risk involved that you just described. That's a great. Yeah, you always say that the end game is not pretty, and also that lending has to, by definition, equal its demand plus interest, right? That creates that kind of trap that it's tough to get out of, or almost impossible for that matter. But and it just grows, right? So do you think is there a limit for, let's say we see that US bonds or just treasuries are just used as collateral for the whole Eurodollar system to actually borrow in the first place, and that demand just grows? Otherwise you wouldn't see like a rehypothecation of collateral, which is incredible to try to fathom how big that is. When is it too much? Is there a ceiling at all? Can we just go further to 100 trillion in debt and just claim that it's just higher for demand? What breaks in that case?
So people will not like this answer. So
go ahead. That's what we're here for.
I'm just warning you ahead of time. So as I said at the very beginning, I am somebody who believes that debt matters. And so I'm not going to sit here and say that this can go on forever. I don't think it can go on forever. And I think there's going to be really bad consequences. But based on the design of the system and based on U.S. hegemony and based on the number of advantages that the United States has. Again, whether they're deserved or not deserved, the U.S. just has an incredible amount of advantages. That while debt does matter, it's going to matter in other countries before it matters in the United States. So in other words, there is not going to be a situation where the U.S. can no longer fund itself, but Brazil can fund itself, and South Africa can fund itself, and India can fund itself, and China, and da 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 da. And so I believe that there will be a progression of dominoes for many of the reasons that I've already discussed, on this show and then many other places. Because the U.S. has global seigniorage, they will be the last domino to fall, in my opinion. Now, is it possible somehow that there's nothing that's impossible, but the high likelihood is, just based on the design of the system, that the U.S. dollar falls last. Doesn't mean it won't fall, just that it falls last. And so I think that I think the budget deficits that the United States will run, I think whatever your estimates for the budget deficits, I think you should increase them. I think they're going to get bigger. I think they're going to get bigger than anybody believes. And I think they will get bigger and last longer than people think possible. So it doesn't mean that it won't end. It will end. It will end badly, but I don't think it will end yet.
Is that the true money printer, so to speak, by just issuing that as?
Sure.
Okay, got it.
Because again, what the U.S. can do, if they wanted to, they can say, you know what? We're going to print more money, but we're only going to give it to domestic firms. We're not going to give it to, we're not giving it to anybody outside the country. We're not and they can put on tariffs, and they can put on sanctions. And I know a lot of people say, well, that will hurt the U.S. Yes, it will hurt the U.S. Everybody is going to feel pain, right? But it's a relative game. I'm 52. Are you as old as I am?
I'm 40.
Okay, so I grew up in the 80s, and so when I think back to my childhood, I think of 80s music and 80s movies and 80s sports. And so one of the analogies I use is, I think it was like 1982 or 1983. There was a boxing match between Marvin Hagler and Thomas Hearns. It was like the biggest boxing match. It was like a welterweight title, and it was 3 rounds, and and these were like 2 of the top ranked boxers of all time. And in the very first round, Thomas Hearns hit Marvin Hagler so hard that he cut his eye, and it was bleeding so much they almost had to stop the fight. But somehow they made it through the first round, and they went back to their corners, and somehow Hagler's team got the bleeding to stop. And then they came back out. They had a couple more rounds. And in the 3rd round, Hagler knocked Hearns out. So Hagler won. And so my point in saying this is, I'm not saying the U.S. won't get hit. I think the U.S. will get hit. And it will probably hurt. And there will probably be blood. But the U.S. has the ability to throw knockout punches like nobody else. Now, is it a guaranteed that will happen? No. I can't say for sure. But I know that the U.S. isn't going to go down without a fight. And so I think for those reasons that the U.S. has staying power better than most. And if it ever comes to this craziness, I think the dollar goes a lot higher. And this is my point to people who say that, they're just going to print the money. It's not going to be any problem. The dollar's days are done. It's going to fall. Yeah, maybe that's right. But it's unlikely that it's going to fall more than other currencies. And it's unlikely that we're going to get into a situation where the rest of the world doesn't want our money because they already owe so much in dollars, they kind of have to have it. And until the whole world can agree on how to settle $35 trillion of debt between themselves, they don't owe this dollar, they don't owe this debt to the United States, they owe it to each other. Until the rest of the world can come together and figure out a single solution to the 35 trillion that they owe to each other in dollars, it's hard to see how the dollar falls significantly.
Yeah, no, it's a really complicated puzzle. So I know that your time is very valuable. I would like to thank you thanks so much for your presence, for your time. But just for us to wrap up, can you tell us, for those who are not familiar with your work, how can people find you? And I understand you also have you launched the MacroAlchemist with some reports and even your masterclass. So I would like to give it the floor for that as well.
Well, I should say, your Brazilian audience may like this. My company is named after the Camino de Santiago, but I discovered the Camino de Santiago through a Brazilian author, Paulo Coelho. So he wrote a book called The Alchemist, and then he wrote another book called The Pilgrimage. And both of those, anyway, so this is the map behind me, is the map of the Camino de Santiago. And then we started this research service called the MacroAlchemist. Get that from Paulo Coelho as well. So if you go to macroalchemist.com, you have to sign up. You put your name and your contact information in, but then you will get, you'll be on a list that you'll get all of our reports going forward. And you can find all of our previous reports as well. We've got a number of them on there. One of them is on the carry trades that we just discussed. So if you found that interesting, that would be a good report to download. The other place you can find me is I do a show called Milkshakes, Markets, and Madness. That's on YouTube. You can find that. We do that once a week. At some point, if you sign up for the Macro Alchemist, you will also be on the list for the masterclass. So the masterclass is where I'm going to go. We're going to do that in Q1 of 2025. And it's going to be a deep dive into what the dollar milkshake theory is. And the reason we decided to do the milkshake masterclass is because, I come on a show like this, or I do a program, or I do a podcast, or I go to a conference, and I speak for maybe 30, 40 minutes, maybe an hour. But the problem is there's probably 100 hours of work that went in, or actually more than that went into the whole thesis. And I can never cover it all on one podcast or one presentation. So I thought what I would do is hold a one-day kind of seminar where I go into much more detail than I've ever been able to go into. And then that's how, perhaps you get a better understanding of the framework that I use. And then finally, the last place that you can find me is I'm pretty active on Twitter. Santiago AU Fund is the handle, but you can also just search Santiago Capital. It's a white scallop shell is the symbol. And I think that's it. I'm happy to come back and speak with you at some point in the future if you want to. And,
Fantastic. No, that would be my pleasure. So yeah, Brent, thank you so much. Gonna be following your work for sure, and also already subscribed to the masterclass. So let's see how that goes. Really excited about that. Yeah. So everybody, I'm gonna put the links to the description so you can find Brent. And really appreciate the talk. Thank you so much, Brent.
All right. Thanks for having me.